Welcome, Color of Success podcast family. I'm your host, Dr. Stephanie J. Wong. Check out my memoir, Cancel the Filter, Realities of a Psychologist, Podcaster, and Working Mother of Color, where I share my experiences in the realm of mental health, both professionally and personally. Color of Success podcast is streaming on all your favorite platforms and socials. Whether you're on the go or comfy on the sofa, you can tune in at your own comfort. As you know, we love growing discussions with our guests from our AAPI and ethnic minority communities. With so many friends and experts from different aspects of life, we love learning their stories and understanding what their success means to them. Let's get into it. As founding violist of the Sol Quartet, Charlton Lee has contributed significantly to the development of the contemporary string quartet, its repertoire, and place in our community for over 3 decades. Premiering hundreds of new works at major venues across North America, Europe, and Asia, he has also spearheaded major commissions from various composers. As performer and educator, he has had a profound influence on students of all ages, from innovative school programs to adult amateur chamber music workshops to rural residencies. Charlton received a bachelor's degree in applied mathematics and physics from UC Berkeley and a master's degree in music from San Francisco Conservatory of Music. Consequently, he is likely the only person to have published articles in both Physics Review Letters and Strings Magazine, in addition to a TEDx talk on just intonation. Charlton, thank you so much for joining me on the show today.
Absolutely, my pleasure.
We have so much to dive into. I'm hoping that you can tell us a little bit about the Sounds Current podcast and the Angel Island project.
Yeah, so the Angel Island project was something we started, I believe, in 2017, or we started thinking about it then. We had met composer Huang, who is a fabulous composer. And I had heard, like a couple of years prior to that, an opera of his, Dr. Sun Yat-sen, about the founder of modern China. Mm-hmm. And it was the first opera that I had ever heard in a Western style sung completely in Chinese. And I just thought the way that he set the music to the language was incredibly beautiful and appropriate. I think I think people may not necessarily think of it, but the music and the language needs to go well together. So, there's a reason that rock and roll works so well in English, because that's a little bit just the way we speak, to the ba-da, ba-da, ba, but that's how English kind of flows. Whereas if you think about Italian opera, like much more dramatic, but if you listen to the Italian language, it is much more dramatic. There's a lot more inflection and pitch range, and so that feels more appropriate. But when you use, for example, English in that kind of a style, it's like, I want to go to the store. It sounds silly. And so the same thing with Chinese. It's like, if it isn't set in a way that feels like it's more natural to the language, it sounds odd. And I just love the way his treatment of the language. And so I began to dream of a project to do where we could use the Chinese language. And then living here in San Francisco and looking out at our bay, and the biggest island there is Angel Island. Mm-hmm. And of course, this history of immigration and detention and discrimination, and the fact that there are these poems that have been carved into the walls of the old detention center. We thought, okay, wait a minute. It's like we have Chinese poems carved into the walls of this center, and it would be amazing to let them come to life. And so we began to dream about this project. We then amazingly received a very large grant from the Hewlett Foundation here to pursue this dream. And that is how the project came to life. That was the first part.
So something clearly resonated with you. What experiences really encouraged you to dive deeper into the socio-cultural political times that had an impact on Angel Island being so significant?
Well, it's interesting that, a lot of people don't think about Asian discrimination until the pandemic, and all of a sudden there were some very blatant examples of that coming out. I'm old enough that I think, in fact, the Chinese Exclusion Act, the first act that specifically targets one race or people from one place, um, the last vestiges of that law were not struck down until the year I was born. So it's fairly recent history, and I think, growing up here in the States, one of the I think one of the type of discrimination that a lot of Asians face is not what we normally hear about. But I mean, I grew up in quite liberal places, and so the kids knew that you're not supposed to use the N word. That was off limits, right? But however, chink was fine, and nobody seemed to care or know anything, and the teachers didn't know what to do with it. They would just kind of laugh it off. And so we were just caught in this weird middle ground that nobody had any awareness about, and it was always kind of this felt in this just like a very odd place. Nobody talked about it, and so I felt like I wanted to do something to bring to light some of these issues. And ironically, after we got the grant and we started working on this project, then of course the pandemic hit, and then we began to experience really blatant racism again. I don't think that it just showed up all of a sudden, right? It was always there, but all of a sudden it came to the surface. So many other Asian friends. I live in San Francisco, and so even here, it's like we were experiencing examples of outright racism, which we hadn't been encountering, but all of a sudden during the pandemic, all of a sudden this stuff, it seemed somehow it was like let loose, and so it really it made the project even more relevant and even more important to release.
So, one thing that really resonates with me when you sent in some of your thoughts about this episode was the idea of music being a method for healing, and in terms of a larger community collective healing as well. So, could you tell me a little bit more about your perspective on how you or others have been able to incorporate music as a form of, therapy augmentation or therapy?
Yeah. I mean, for our Angel Island project, it took a huge community effort. There were a lot of people involved on many, many different levels, both historically and in terms of production and everything else. And so I think for us, the idea of using art to bring to light um, the sort of issues that people wouldn't necessarily talk about, or issues that are perhaps difficult to talk about. But if we present them in a way where it's kind of laid out, and we're not always necessarily making a specific judgment, but just like laying it out for people to make their own decisions, make their own interpretations. And I think that makes it a little bit safer in many ways, or more. It's easier for people to access it and to contemplate it. And if you're experiencing a piece of music in particular, like because it's something that you experience in real time, and you just have to be there for the duration of the performance, it gives you time to contemplate the issues that are being brought about. We also, for the premiere here, our good friend Andy Wong, who's a community activist and artist, she set up a beautiful exhibit. This was in the detention center on Angel Island. And so people could not only come experience the performance, but also to look at some of the photographs and historical um, uh, pictures and stuff beyond what is already in the detention center, which is a museum, right? But she created even another exhibit on top of that. So I think that method, and of course, people then they're wandering through these halls where you can see the poems carved on the walls. So it's I think it's a really powerful experience. And even when we premiered it in New York, they were willing to bring her out and have this like full blown exhibit in the lobby at the Brooklyn Academy of Music, and people just stayed there after the show and talked and looked at the pictures, and so yeah.
That's awesome. Yeah, I've read a lot of Lisa C's books, and the Shanghai Girls really had that aspect of it to kind of explain maybe some experiences that some may have had. But for those that haven't really heard much about the history, I'm wondering if you can summarize it a little bit.
Okay, I'll try to do it quickly. It's the detention center on Angel Island was in operation from 1910 to 1940. There was other detention centers on the mainland before that, but I think they were finding ways to escape sometimes, and so and all plus the earthquake and all that stuff, and so then they moved it to the island, so people had no escape. Um, this was all happening during the Chinese Exclusion Act years, which I mentioned earlier. This is a law that really put heavy restrictions on Chinese immigration. Conveniently created after the Chinese had a huge part in building the railroads, the levees here in California, done tremendous backbreaking work. Many thousands of them died in the process. And then when they had earned their keep and had decided they wanted to stay and build a life for themselves here, basically were told to get out, right? And then new people prevented from coming in. So when people did try to come over from China, they were held, they were detained, basically in a prison, in very difficult, overcrowded conditions. And during this time, they underwent interrogations, often in the form of, hundreds, if not thousands of questions, trying to catch them on some kind of a mistake, in which case, to find grounds to send them back. Mm-hmm. Oftentimes that would have been a death sentence for them, because they would have, perhaps the family or perhaps even the entire village had chipped together to try and raise money in order for this one person to come across. And if they were sent back, they were completely destitute. They had nothing, and all the, whatever money they had borrowed, they were screwed, basically. Mm-hmm. So there were a fair amount of suicides of people who were caught in this dilemma. And I spoke to one Angel Island descendant who said that her father remembers being brought there by her granddad, and that he pointed out, it's like, oh yeah, this is where somebody hung themselves, and so it's like really bleak, dark stuff. So during this time, in those 30 years, Chinese people were held there for, sometimes it was just days, but it often extended to weeks, months. The longest was like into the years. So not knowing whether they would be admitted or whether they would be sent back. And it was a very tough and difficult situation. And they were basically put in a prison and mm-hmm. just sort of in this limbo land. I think much like we're still experiencing on our southern borders right now.
It's so bad. It's so awful. Like, it's so ironic too that like we've moved past 1940, I mean, in terms of actual years, and we're still seeing this treatment of immigrants or people that contribute to the country. I mean, immigrants become villainized, and most of them are trying to make a life for themselves that are under better circumstances. So And also to add to that, thank you. That was a great summary, by the way. But to add to that summary is that it gave rise to this idea of paper sons, where they had to, on paper, say that someone was their son, and they had to pretty much practice and rehearse these interview answers so that they wouldn't be tripped up. And also, it was at the discretion of the interviewer or folks at the detention center whether they accepted those answers or not.
That's right. The earthquake, for those people out there who don't know about this, the earthquake in San Francisco destroyed all the records of people living in the area. So that allowed a lot of the Chinese folks to then say, "Hey, I was born here. I'm a citizen."
Mm-hmm.
And so by doing that, then they would, and then they would say, "It's like, okay, I have, I have a son or daughter or whatever that I would like to bring over." And so these arrangements were created again, of course, because of this the
Mm-hmm.
Exclusion Act, to trying to find ways around it so to get people to still come here. But after the Exclusion Act was massive in terms of the impact it had on Asian immigration, because, for example, places like Idaho, after the railroad was built, um, Idaho was like 28% Chinese. There's like some crazy numbers like that, right? And and so the Exclusion Act, by the time I think when I was born, there was still only a couple 100,000 Chinese people in this country. And so it really, it was really curtailed um, Asian immigration
Yeah.
in a massive way. I mean, I think the history of this country would be different if it were not for that law.
And thinking about the Bay Area, I'm a native San Franciscan, and I am just so sad to see this shift, right? Some people deny and say, well, it's always happened in San Francisco. People break down windows and stuff. I think we're in a state, though, of desperation as a people, as in the United States, of like, some people just want what they want now, and they will just take it literally and figuratively. So, how do you see, if any, changes in San Francisco over time? Because I don't know, for me personally, I just feel really sad about the way things are progressing there.
It's changing. I can't say necessarily if it's for better or for worse. There's definitely changes happening, and the politics seem to be shifting now again as well. But I still don't see enough Asians getting involved in the politics here.
Mm,
And there's such a large number of them here, and all I see in general is that they are being taken advantage of. Um, it's unfortunately, as like, the original, um, especially the large enclaves of Asians that live on the western part of the city. There's been like a systematic, I'm not sure if it's, it was intentional, but there's like a systematic movement to slowly erode our access to get out of the city,
mm,
between the you might know, like the various like highway entrance on ramps and stuff that had been like delayed and then taken away, and then and it was like even like a trick on the voting schemes where they produced a second vote proposition that seemed to counter the first. Anyway, there's a lot of weird complications. And even now they're trying to get rid of the Great Highway, which is the main access for a lot of people living on the western part of the city to go south. And which if they take that away, and this is largely a bicycle coalition that's pushing for this, so that they can have an extra playground when there's already a bike path there. But then, of course, that forces massive traffic into other areas, and anyway, but there's not enough outcry, I think, from the Asian community that it's like, hey, what's going on here? It's like you're cutting us off. So
So, what are your thoughts on ways to mobilize the community or even get involved in some of the projects and advocacy that you and other allies participate in?
Yeah, I think for us, I mean, for me as a an artist, I mean that's my medium, and so trying to present art that can support the community and to bring awareness. So the Angel Island was this a big one, but we're currently working on a new project with poet Jenny Lim, who is a just an amazing artist in her own right. And she's also a longtime community activist. She was one of the three authors of the original book Island, which translated the poems from Angel Island back in the 80s, I think,
Mm.
um, maybe 90s, 80s or 90s. And so that was the first, their efforts to take these poems, get them published, both in Chinese and with her English translations. And there's, be able to share like over 200 poems
Wow.
from, yeah. So we have a project right now called the Songs of the Diaspora
Hmm.
with her. She's creating new poetry for it. And we're working with three female composers of Chinese descent, but with very, very different immigration stories, which I think, that's another aspect. People who are not Chinese often don't realize that, the Chinese community here is not monolithic by any by any stretch of the imagination. They have such different backgrounds. I mean, China is such a huge place, and beyond that, people who have already migrated from China to other places, maybe sometimes for generations, and then come here. They are ethnically Chinese, but their stories are so different and diverse. Um, and so we just wanted to share a little bit about people's immigration stories in this new project, combining music with poetry. We also have uh, there's also going to be lasers and video projections as well. So that's coming out next spring sometime.
Oh, that sounds amazing. And where can people find more information about the project and the Angel Island project as well?
Yeah. So the best way to learn about our Angel Island project is our new podcast, and this is something that we were encouraged to do by a big uh, supporter, and we basically made recordings of interviews amongst ourselves and with our collaborators during the project, and put together this podcast. And I think it's a really cool, in-depth look at how a small arts organization can put together a project and all the community partners that we have. And then we had the honor of being selected, being in an official selection for the Tribeca Festival, which was just like mind blowing. We had no idea. I mean, our producer said, "Oh, why don't we submit this?" I think, why not? And then when we got it, it was like, wait, what? Because like we were one of four selections in our category, which is the indie nonfiction category. So that was an incredible honor, and so that's the best way to learn about the Angel Island project. Obviously, to get more about all the things that we do, delsolquartet.com is our website, and you can go there to look at both. There's like samples of music and you can take a look at all our different CDs and all our different projects that are going on. And if you want to learn more, sign up for our newsletter. We are on Instagram, Facebook, X at delsolquartet.com. No, just at delsolquartet. Yeah.
Thank you so, so much. Anything else you can kind of think of that I didn't ask you that you wanted to put out there?
I think no, just to encourage people to, share their stories and to speak out and to just build more awareness. And I think the way, like one of our partners, Victor Yan, who was a longtime Chinatown community activist, when we all came together to produce this musical event, he said it was, even though it was a very dark history, a dark chapter in our history, and yet he said, like, the feeling of everybody coming together to experience this was like Chinese New Year. So I think maybe I'll leave you with that.
I mean, that is a great feeling. And I think part of what you were talking about, sharing your stories, integrating music into that, only brings people closer together. So it is so admirable and amazing as to what you and the community are doing.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening. We would love for you to subscribe to the podcast and join our community on all our socials at colorsuccesspodcast.com. Looking forward to you checking out my memoir, Cancel the Filter, Realities of a Psychologist, Podcaster, and Working Mother of Color on Amazon and wherever books are sold. I'd love to hear your Cancel the Filter moments.